Thanks for listening to this Word in Your Ear podcast. If you'd like to get early access to all our productions ad-free, priority booking for our live events, and to take part in our weekly quiz, go to patreon.com/wordinyourear for more details.
You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
We begin with a stack ordy based on an idea by listener Barry Hill. Are you ready for this, Mark?
Hit me with it. Come on.
And I suppose if it had a title, this title would be Neil Young or Not Neil Young. Okay.
Neil or no you, Neil. That's right, yes.
Right. So we got 5 of them, and one of them is not Neil Young. Okay, and the other 4 are song titles. Are you ready?
I am. I'm pretty rusty on Neil Young outside the classic period, but go on. Try me.
Here we go. Safeway Cart. Safeway Cart. The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven. The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven. Terrorist Suicide Hang Gliders. Terrorist Suicide Hang Gliders. Let's Impeach the President. Let's Impeach the President. And finally, a Rockstar Bucks a coffee shop. A Rockstar Bucks a coffee shop. Which of those 5 is not the work of Neil Young? Over to you, Mark Allen.
Wow. Well, Let's Impeach the President is Neil Young. I'm absolutely convinced.
It is. It comes from his album Living with War, which came out in 2006.
That's the one. And I think the Lone Ranger and Tonto, I'm convinced, is Neil Young too.
Well, there you'd be wrong.
Oh, no. Oh, no. So confidently, I have now fallen into the bear pit.
The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fistfight in Heaven is a book by Sherman Alexie, a young Native American writer hailed by the New York Times as one of the major lyric voices of our time. I put that one in the list. I'm very pleased with myself.
Very good work. That sounded so plausible. So Safeway Cart is.
It comes from
Terrorist Suicide Hang Gliders is.
It comes from Peace Trail, 2006.
Oh, yeah.
And a Rockstar Bucks a coffee shop. Slightly heavy-handed, I feel, Neil.
It is.
Comes from the Monsanto years, 2015. So thanks for that.
I stumbled early there.
Yeah,
that's bad. There was somebody, Les, sent in a thing on Twitter. I don't know if you saw that, about what the oddest thing is that a band's ever been sued for.
Oh,
Did you see that?
Yes.
I thought it was really interesting. And he just said, because it made me think of Neil Young. And he said that he thought the oddest thing was that in 2004, the Dave Matthews Band had tipped £800 of human waste from their tour bus into the Chicago River.
My God.
And this had landed apparently directly on top of a passenger sightseeing boat going through the city. Roughly 2/3 of the 120 passengers on board apparently were soaked. So it was a huge court case. They were fined £300,000 had to make donations to charity. But he was saying, Les was saying, has there been a stranger case? There was a case, wasn't there, of Neil Young being sued, wasn't there?
Well,
not making Neil Young albums.
No, he signed, was it Geffen? I think he signed to Geffen and then proceeded to put out a load of records that you could argue didn't particularly sound like Neil Young, you know.
Yeah.
Well, I can't remember the names of those Trams and so forth, you know, that one where he seemed to be singing through a speak your weight machine, and there are all kinds of other things. And so if you ponied up a fortune on the basis that he was going to turn up with kind of Like a Hurricane or whatever, and then he didn't. He produced a load of albums that weren't anything like Expectation. And so there was talk of legal action, that a company had an expectation that if they signed somebody who's well known for a certain thing, they would continue to produce it. And I thought it was quite an interesting case actually, because it contrasts with the book trade. You know, for instance, so if you're the author of best-selling books, I don't know, if you're author of best-selling, fiction, and then you suddenly decided you wanted to write some sort of polemical political book or whatever, they simply wouldn't publish it, would they? They'd say, I don't care who you are, matey. You know what I mean? This doesn't...
well, if they did, as a kind of charitable gesture to you and to keep a good relationship, they would put it on a different imprint, or they would make a big song and dance about how it's a departure. They might tell you to do it under a fake name. I don't know, but they'd certainly get angsty about it.
Yeah, and like film directors, known for one certain kind of thing, can't suddenly turn around and say they want to do something different, totally different. People are known for certain kind of things. Anyway, that was the case with Neil Young. But wasn't there also John Fogerty?
Oh, yeah, it was.
Who was involved for years and years, 20, 30 years, with kind of running feuds with... the guy who bought Fantasy Records, Saul Zaentz, who was a very successful film producer. And then he put out a record of his own on Asylum, wasn't it? And he was accused of plagiarizing his own material.
That's right.
Old Mine Down the Road, I think it was. Yeah. But it sounded like Run Through the Jungle. I think that was.
It was pretty much the same song, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, okay, but, tell it to Jimmy Reed,
precisely.
Tell it to the Ink Spots, for goodness sake,
Yeah, entirely.
Most musicians.
Any 12-bar blues musician.
Yes, absolutely. It's all the same stuff, anyway. But yeah, the Dave Matthews story, is that real, or is that an episode of The Simpsons?
The Word Podcast, prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
We were talking recently about the whole business of how records end up in soundtracks and films. And very often when the films are shot, they don't specify what the music's going to be because they can't be guaranteed that they're going to get it, So you have all those... That's why all those scenes of people dancing in a nightclub or a disco always look really unconvincing, because they're dancing to nothing.
Yeah.
There's total silence in there. And that stuff will be put on later when they've actually managed to clear the music. Interesting exception to this, I noticed this week. I don't know if you've seen the new True Detective cop kind of series.
No, I've not watched any, but you said
this is number 4. They're very well done, They're very kind of gritty. This one stars Jodie Foster as the kind of chief cop, and it takes place in the Arctic Circle during the months when they have no daylight whatsoever, which is quite a shrewd idea if you want to shoot a series, because you're doing it all in the dark, so they never have to wait for the weather to be right or the light to be correct. It's always dark, they can shoot.
You can wrap the whole thing in about 10 days.
Anyway, the first 5 minutes of this thing entirely revolves around the use of one record, and one record in particular. And you know what that record is? It's Twist and Shout by a group called the Beatles, which is, I think, is pretty amazing.
It is amazing.
Because, it must take a few quid to get a Beatles tune, even if it's not one
it's not, well, again, it's not a Beatles tune, so it's probably a discount, isn't it, actually? You get the Beatles, but without the tune.
Yeah, but you're still going to clear the Beatles and so forth. And, but it actually, contains references to the Beatles in the script in the first 5 minutes, So it had to be the Beatles. They had no other way of doing it, So somebody stops the music at some point and says, I never did like the Beatles, I just thought it was absolutely extraordinary, to be that specific about a record in a drama. I can't think of another example.
Also, a great plot, a great narrative moment to have somebody not liking the Beatles, because therein a really free and frank exchange of views will inevitably take place.
Yeah, it's a good job I wasn't there, really.
I know. Well, as you and I have often made absolutely clear, anybody saying they don't like the Beatles is simply occupying a position, aren't they? They don't mean it. They just want attention and they want to stir things up.
Yes.
Can't possibly mean it.
That's Jodie Foster in True Detective 4, to a T. Anyway, in other news, Danny Baker tells me his records are finally going at the end of this month. They're finally going. This giant record collection. He's been talking about getting rid of it for years.
Wonder how many that is. He's got rid of the singles already, hasn't he?
Yeah, this is the LPs. They're going at the end of the month. Anyway, and he and I were discussing, if that's the appropriate term, on social media, the fact that and Danny collects his collection is pretty much 70s records, really. I think that's the center of it. We're discussing how even the most kind of apparently reviled and ignored records from the 70s, records that even deep end record shop haunting bores like me and Danny, even we had never heard of before, still seem to have some kind of following in the new world of discogs and rare vinyl and repressings and all this kind of thing. And we've got some examples here that stuff I'd never heard of before. Have you ever heard of a band called Red Dirt, Mark?
No, you mentioned them. No, I hadn't ever heard of them, but the album goes for sort of 1,500 quid or something, doesn't it?
Well, I don't know about that much, but it's amazing. You look up on Discogs, even the record as obscure and unloved as Red Dirt, you get comments from people underneath, People who obviously, they haunt Discogs, just saying to people, yeah, I've got that record. That's what they want to do, Yeah. And so somebody comments here on Red Dirt, great pressing.
Oh, that's great.
Things nobody ever said in the 1970s. Great pressing. Absolutely extraordinary. But anyway, I was wondering aloud on Twitter, what were those records from the 1970s that always sat in bargain bins and nobody ever wanted at all? And now they appear to be, they have some kind of following. And of course, the obvious one is Fat Mattress. Mark, you remember?
Oh, yeah, Fat Mattress. Idiotically, I had a Fat Mattress album and I gave it away to somebody. Why did I do that? Because, of course, Fat Mattress is very collectible. It has a member of the Jimi Hendrix Experience.
Member of the Jimi Hendrix Experience. And,
Now, what do those records go for now?
Well, I don't know. I can't find but there's a kind of a vigorous trade in them, even though one of the comments here says, quite rightly, rather unremarkable late 60s psych, which is a fair description. But anyway, I was asking on Twitter for people's other suggestions, and somebody suggested, I don't know if you remember this, Atomic Roosters, in hearing of Atomic Roosters.
Yeah.
Which, can you describe the cover of that record, Mark? Can you get that?
No, I can't remember the cover.
Okay, it's got I think it's a Roger Dean illustration of a kind of grandma figure with an ear trumpet, dealing with the distant sound of Atomic Rooster. That one was always in bargain bins. And the other one that I think Top Taylor responded, I asked about this. He said all the albums by Stray. Do you remember all
Stray?
Stray.
But very, very long hair.
Incredibly long hair.
Yeah.
Had a record
rather effeminate looking.
Had a record called Saturday Morning Pictures, which was always in the bargain bins. Because if something was always in the bargain bins, it tended to mean that somebody at some stage thought it was worth pressing a load of them, and then they didn't sell. So you also get cases of this with better known acts. And I was trying to think about this morning. Do you know what the Elton John...
It's the Paul Young No Parlay equivalent, isn't it?
Well, No Parlay sold a load of copies. But there was an Elton John record that didn't sell at all, I seem to remember. Caribou. Do you remember Caribou?
Yeah.
And there was also Rock of the Westies. Didn't sell at all. Because they always came after Goodbye Yellow Brick Road or something that had been absolutely huge. So they pressed millions of copies, put millions of copies into the shops. Nobody bought them at all. So Paul Kramer was pointing out to me also that the Clash of Sandinista started with massive commercial expectations, which were not fulfilled at all. And so there were copies of that cluttering up bargain bins all over North London, and whenever that came out, 79, 80. There was.
I tell you a record I found. I remember Budgie's albums often used to finish up in bargain bins. Budgie just were generally considered to be laughable. I had a look at eBay this morning, and the first Budgie album, people are selling for 350 quid. Isn't that amazing? Never Turn Your Back on a Friend by Budgie is 180 quid. I mean, that's astonishing, I think.
Well, they just
Bedsitter Images by Al Stewart. People are selling for $195 in America. It's incredible. I just was idly going through some records I had, and I dug up one which was Dr. Dunbar's Prescription by the Ainsley Dunbar Retaliation. Admittedly, they were a bit fashionable at the time, but that's 150 quid.
Mark, I'm going to interrupt you. Despite your delusions, the Ainsley Dunbar Retaliation, I can categorically state, were never, ever, not even for a second, fashionable.
Oh, weren't they?
You just thought they were.
I just thought they were because I
in
had
your
the
little
record.
world because you had the record.
I thought they were.
They were
God.
never at all. Have you got it there? I want to see it.
I've literally got it right by the machine.
He's going to hold it up in front of me if he can find it.
Here it is.
Is it the one with the blurry cover?
Yeah. It works upside down. There, it's a hypnosis cover, actually.
Oh, is it really?
Hypnosis cover, and there they are in a kind of infrared picture of them by a boat, I think, on the shore of a lake.
That'll be Poe Powell will have got himself infrared film.
Ainsley Dunbar, Victor Brox, Alex Domachowski, and John Morshead. I thought they were sensational. So I've now discovered that's worth 150 quid. Is that amazing?
I tell you what struck me this week, actually. We're now 24 years into the 21st century. And just the sheer passage of time has meant that all the records that belong to the 20th century suddenly seem like legitimate antiques.
Yeah.
Because they're from a departed age, aren't they?
Yeah.
And they're sort of not making any more of them, So, they're now, regardless of their musical qualities or properties, they've got the appeal of kind of, I don't know, George's snuff boxes.
They do. They have a patina, don't they? That's so true.
And
old marble ashtrays, old tins. That's right.
That's the only possible explanation for the fact that Saturday Morning Pictures by Stray, or or Budgie's, what do you call it? Never Turn Your Back on a Friend.
Yeah.
Are still going for hundreds of pounds.
I think it's bizarre. I mean, it's more bizarre than the idea that those obscure records that were just very rare are expensive. There's a record called Dreaming of Alice by Mark Fry, which I'm sure you've heard of. They only pressed about 700 copies. It was a psychedelic folk record kind of made in 1972 in Italy. And that now sells for, £3,000. It's amazing. Just because it's a collectible item, I think, The Garden of Jane Trelawney by Trees.
That is very...
Well, that's a pretty standard price for that is 650 quid. Unbelievable. But it's still something much more astonishing about records that at the time were considered to be laughably awful and now collectible and been reconsidered as being classics.
But but let's take this a step further. Do you think we have now reached the stage with popular music where you're not sort of allowed to laugh at anything anymore? You and I have amused ourselves for years by, picking on helpless pop groups and going, they're funny, they're risible. You know what I mean? If you can't laugh at that lot, what can you laugh at?
Yeah.
And after
Uriah Heep being a great example.
Absolutely. The perfect example. And you're kind of not allowed to nowadays because there's always somebody going to come along and say, actually, they were much misunderstood and much maligned.
Yes, in a slightly wounded register. But actually, me and my friends, in some corner of a foreign field, we are here waving our flags.
No, but there was somebody start a program on Six Music dedicated to just this particular strand of kind of hopeless groups who were once on Charisma or something like that.
That's right.
You can't have a good belly laugh at the expense of a pop group any longer, can you? Because they all become kind of objects of reverence. That's what I feel anyway.
We've talked about this before, that nobody is forgotten on the internet, and everybody has a small following, don't they, rooting for them, and who've kind of rediscovered them and feel that the world should hear them.
I'm going to go further, because thanks to the internet, they don't have a small following anymore, because they have an international, multi-generational following, if they have any following at all. And therefore, the number of people, rooting for Budgie nowadays is probably greater than the number
than it was at the time.
Back in the time, because they're only dealing with the people that they happen to, encounter.
Also, doesn't it all key into our basic desire to support underdogs?
Oh, yeah.
Everybody loves the idea of somebody's bit mistreated, underrated, underloved. Yeah. And they just want to... It's a sort of sense of charity, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
But Burke Shelley, I think, God bless him, the late Burke Shelley died, didn't he, a couple of years ago, I think. Would be awfully thrilled to think that his records were 350 quid. There you go.
I don't know why, but this seems to lead me to discuss the subject of the closure of Pitchfork, the what is it? It's a media thing, a website.
It's a kind of music website, online magazine, isn't it? I don't know if it's officially been closed. It's sort of been wound into GQ, hasn't it? It's the idea.
Yeah, for some reason it was owned by Condé Nast, or ended up being owned by Condé Nast, who are the publishers of very high-toned, titles like Vanity Fair and Vogue and all sorts of things. And then they're known for being very good at high-end advertising. So why they had Pitchfork, I do not know at all, because it ain't high-end advertising, really.
No, but it would probably make GQ's advertising sell a bit more attractive because it's a little bit hipper. It's got a musical connection. But I mean, I don't know.
Anyway, it's been it's been merged into GQ behind a smokescreen of absolute corporate bullshit, which I do recommend to you.
It's sensationally funny, isn't it?
It's clearly not written by Annie Winter at all. Written by somebody on behalf of Annie Winter. Yeah. Anna Winter. It's got her name at the bottom because she's the editorial director or whatever she is. And that it's moving into an exciting new phase and all that.
All those cliches that make you and I shudder. And it really worked in the publishing business.
But anyway, I mean, some people have lost their jobs, which is very sad. And, there's the usual, wailing and gnashing of teeth about what's going to happen to music magazines and so forth. What's going to happen to music criticism, which people... The interesting thing to me is that, I follow a lot of that debate, and it's now talked about as if it's kind of... Is it some threatened little corner of the arts? It's as if people are talking about how do we preserve ballet or poetry or whatever, you know what I mean? And it's this thing that, 20, 30 years ago was a massive, great commercial engine, which is, pop music and the interest in bands and new bands and all their activities and so forth. And people are now arguing that it sort of ought to be protected. And I just can't see how that's ever going to come about. And the one thing that never seems to enter this debate, people talk about, well, bands need coverage and all that stuff, and I understand that. And, record companies need to do this, and writers need a place to write and all this stuff. But this is only going to work. It's only going to be sustainable if there is stuff that people want to read. And then the stuff that music papers, music magazines used to deal in was stuff people really wanted to read, partly because they couldn't read it anywhere else. And so...
But all those things have gone now, because that was reviews, really, wasn't it? And that was news, and all that stuff, obviously, from other sources. The thing that will protect certain elements of the music magazine landscape is that fetishistic love of seeing a kind of time capsule re-entered. Mojo do it really well, I think. Those
but that's
beautiful
paper.
layouts.
That works on paper.
Yeah, it works on paper, precisely.
It doesn't work online at all.
No, not remotely.
Because online has no context. Nobody goes back to a website and says, do you know what the Guardian Online was saying about so-and-so's album when it came out in...
Do you remember this issue, the Guardian Online? Oh, it's classic.
They don't do it at all. They just don't do it at all. Whereas they're constantly hauling out old copies of Smash Hits or Q or whatever and saying, look at this. Generally some review written by me in a hurry or whatever, because they can point to it on a bit of paper. It's in that time capsule. Material on the internet is not. It's just material on the internet. You have no sense of when it arrived there at all. People don't read it with that sense at all.
And also, you don't get that sense of context, which is what makes music magazines interesting. It's the proximity of that piece alongside all the ads and the news stories and the other things that were on the page. That's what makes it work.
Yeah, absolutely. And, so, I mean, I think when these closures of these titles or the merging of these titles happens from time to time, which it does, I always think the same thing, which is if you're convinced that there's something in that title and that you can make something of it that the current owner's not making of it, go to them. Go to them. They'll do you a deal. They'll probably let you have it.
They'll be thrilled to hear from you.
Because it's
give it to you for £1.
Yeah. But I don't know. I don't know if anybody's ever tried that. But I can't help but think that they would probably say, fine, take it.
I do miss the old the paper product music press enormously. I was down at the Rock's Back Pages office the other day recording a podcast, and they have bound editions of every Q and every Select and every Mojo and every Enemy and Melody Maker. Fantastic. Just a huge, huge library. And I kind of miss that time, don't you? That there was something there making sense of it all, making sense of the whole landscape. It was all divided up into the tribes, It was the electronic stuff over here and reggae over there, and there's post-punk stuff over there, and, the big rock acts, and the things on factory records. And the whole world was full of these enormously ramped-up cartoon characters who were immensely entertaining. And I kind of miss that ability to make sense of it all. And also the perspectives that music journalists got from just simply spending time with pop stars, off guard. And you very rarely get any of that now. Don't you think?
Oh, no, you don't get it at all. I mean, I can't remember the last time anybody said to me, oh, you've got to read this about this.
Chris Heath's Quincy Jones piece, I think it was, possibly in GQ, I think, was the last time I can remember everyone saying, you absolutely have to read this. It's astonishing. And that was one of those rare examples of someone saying, this is everything that happened to me in my life that's controversial and funny and over the top and insane and involves somebody famous. It was fantastic. But no, you're right. Now, I think not, because everything's so modified, isn't it? And so protected and there's so little access that you're not going to have much to say apart from the fact they've got a new record out.
Or if they're going to say something, they're going to say it themselves. They don't need a kind of... They don't need a media.
Well, they prefer to say it themselves because then they can edit exactly what they say.
Yeah, but also, I think there are cases where it's quite legitimate for them to say it themselves because it won't get distorted, or it's less likely to.
Exactly.
If they do it themselves. I don't have any problem with that at all. But, you can't wish the music media back into existence by suggesting that it's good for you.
Yeah.
That won't work. The only way
people are saying support music magazines like the way they say support record shops, you've got to go. But people just didn't go to record shops because they'd stopped going to record shops. They weren't going to do it out of a sense of charity, were they?
No, well, except they ended up doing it out of sense of kind of antiques. For the reasons that we've just been talking about.
Yeah.
But, with the media, you've got to provide something that people really want, really, really want. And they used to really, really want the new NME or the new Q or the new smash hits. They really wanted it. And this was, if these things didn't appear for any reason, industrial dispute or whatever, people's whole week would be ruined, wouldn't it?
Mine would. It would upset the rhythm of life completely.
You can't imagine that. You can't imagine people...
I had to know what was happening at the Leicester de Montfort Hall, even though I wasn't in any danger of going there.
But if you translate that into the contemporary world, even if something as big as Netflix disappeared for a month, the world would just shrug and carry on. Nobody would be terribly bothered about it at all, because there's millions of things. There's millions of options to amuse yourself this evening, this weekend, whenever. It didn't used to be like that. You used to have a lot of time and not much stuff. Now you have unlimited stuff and not much time.
Not much time. But back then, I can remember a copy of the NME arriving in the house and it just being passed from person to person who would virtually read it from cover to cover. You remember that?
Definitely. I used to work in the HMV shop, and I used to go and get the NME at there used to be a WX Smith's in Oxford Circus Station, where it was on sale on Wednesday lunchtime. It was like London travel point. And I'd go up there a few times to get it, and it wouldn't have come. And then I'd go back to the shop, then go back again half an hour later. It wouldn't have come. Go back to the shop. Imagine a human being, Mark.
These puppy dog eyes.
No, Mark. Imagine a human being in the year 2024 going to that trouble for anything.
I know.
Nothing at all. But I went back like 3-4 times, and then it would be there. And then I go back, we put it on the counter, and we go, oh, God, Linda's father on tour. Or
yeah.
I don't know what it was.
Look what Linda Ronstadt's only got and done now.
Look at the albums. And somebody would take it away, and you'd come upon it in the stockroom in the back, and there'd be 4 of them sitting around, smoking, drinking cups of tea, and doing the crossword between.
Yeah.
Doing the crossword.
That's right. One across Dark Side of the Moon.
No, it's probably a bit more difficult than that. Fred Della would have done it.
Yeah.
And, but, talk about simple pleasures. All gone.
This is a junction in the word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
Today, I think, the day we're recording this, actually, the 19th, is the birthday of Robert Palmer. Robert Palmer would have been 75.
Right.
But he died when he was 54, didn't he? I mean, very, very young of a heart attack. And I was just thinking about him, thinking, what an amazing... He's a huge star, wasn't he, at the time? I mean, but a kind of a medium-sized star. But started off very slowly. Vinegar Joe, not terribly satisfactory.
Well, I go back a step before Vinegar Joe. He was in a group called the Alan Bound.
Oh, yes.
Which had grown out of a group called the Alan Bound Set.
Yeah.
And I think at one stage they had not one but 2 lead singers, and he was one, and Jess Roden, I think, was the other.
Yeah.
But then he turned up being in Vinegar Joe, playing opposite Elkie Brooks, who was the kind of young, handsome chap in the scoop neck t-shirt with the tight trousers usually. I think there was an eye for the ladies even in those early days.
But brilliantly marketed by Ireland, wasn't it? I mean, they set him up as being this kind of immensely cool Casanova character. He was terrifically good looking. And there's a girl virtually on every sleeve, isn't there, of the early
first
three albums?
First three. I've got them here in front of me. And these all came out on Ireland. I don't know what year we're talking about, 74, 75, something like that. And they were terribly hip, these records. And they were made with a combination of kind of New Orleans session men. Wow, 1974, wow.
The Meters, people like Little Feat, wasn't it?
Well, Little Feat and the Meters very often. And, produced by Steve Smith. And really interesting kind of range of material, Sneaky Sally from Through the Alley, which was a kind of Lee Dorsey tune, you know. Did they do Pressure Drop? Pressure Drop by Toots and the Maytals on one of those records. I've got the
Very Island Records.
I've got the second cover in front of me, where there he is. I had to show Alex this earlier, and poor Alex, he had to reach for the smelling salts because he
had to stand on a square of cold lino.
He's a young chap, but he's not used to seeing sexually provocative album covers. But here's Robert Palmer in a hotel room, holding a very early TV remote control, and there's a girl, presumably his girlfriend, looking out over the balcony out into the outside world, having neglected to put her clothes on.
No, completely. She's got her shoes on, I think. I don't think anything else. Just her shoes.
She's got her shoes on. And then the third one, which is Some People Can Do What They Like, which I think is my favourite cover, actually. Here he is, actually in the act of playing strip poker.
Strip poker.
Not on his own.
Strip poker, no. You see, hashtag different times.
Does anybody still play strip poker? Strip poker used to be one of the most exciting ideas in the world, wasn't it? When you were in school and college, wasn't it?
I don't think I ever played it. Did you play it, Dave? Be honest with me there. Did you?
I think there might have been.
No. Wow.
Well, I haven't thought about that for years.
The long winter nights must have flown by.
You see, there was
get a Robert Palmer album on, get the cards out, turn the heating up.
All I'm going to say to you, Mark, is there were 3 channels on the television in that.
Yes. We made our own entertainment.
3 channels on the television. You had about 40 records, so you'd have heard them all to death. And, somebody had gone and got a Watney's Party 7. And a bag of crisps. And after a certain while, what else are you going to do with the evening apart from play?
Get the cards out. Get the kit off.
You wouldn't necessarily go.
I've known you for whatever it is, 45 years, 47 years, I think. This is a whole new dimension of your character. This is wonderful. I love it.
You missed all this. You were sitting in your student flat convincing yourself that you're a follower of the very trendy Ainsley Dunbar retaliation.
That's right, I was. That's precisely what I was doing. I'm wasting my time now, I realise.
Absolutely.
An idiotic thing to have done.
So there's Robert Palmer on his birthday. And if you haven't heard those early Island records, they really are terribly good.
They're really
they do stand up terribly well.
They are. And the records he made, some of the records he made in the 80s were really good too, actually.
Well, yeah. Then he had Johnny and Mary and so forth.
You're My Sister, Bad Case of Loving You.
Yeah.
Johnny and Mary, they're brilliant records.
Yeah. But those early ones, those first 3, I would thoroughly recommend.
Yeah.
Film Club. Film Club is a new feature that we've
developed.
And last week we were talking about, because we keep up with all the latest films, and last week we were doing Bonnie and Clyde from 1967. So this year, this week, we come bang up to date with Casablanca from 1940. Is that 42 or 40?
Which is on iPlayer. Anyone listening who has access to BBC iPlayer, it's on there now for a bit longer, actually. It's fantastic, isn't it? I rewatched it. It's fantastic.
It's an extraordinary piece of work. And it's directed by Michael Curtiz, who I think we were talking about the other week as the hardest working director in the history of Hollywood. Did absolutely tons of things. And it's an amazing tale that it was an unproduced play called Everybody Goes to Rick's, which is amazing.
Yeah, and never come out, never been performed.
Never been produced, never been performed. But some studio reader picked this up in New York and thought, it's quite good. And took it to Warner Brothers and said, there's a part in here which is good for one of your gangster stars. And of course, Warner Brothers' reputation in the 30s and early 40s was gangster movies, Jimmy Cagney and George Raft and so forth. And Humphrey Bogart was one of those gangsters. And so, you know, they decided they could do something with Humphrey Bogart in this film. And then they got in Ingrid Bergman. They had to borrow Ingrid Bergman, I think, from David Selznick's company. So she wasn't contracted to Warner's. And she was, you know, very beautiful, very poised, and also 5 inches taller than Humphrey Bogart.
Yeah.
So he does the whole film in 5-inch lifts.
Yeah.
5 inches. That's serious. That's a serious clearance, isn't it, from the ground?
Yeah. Never once do you see them standing together at any point.
Just absolutely fantastic. And
it struck me that the plot hinges around what I suppose really is the equivalent of a text message, isn't it? He's at the station, you remember, and he's waiting for her, and they've agreed to elope. And the Germans have just arrived. They've marched into Paris. And Sam turns up with a note, gives him the note, and he says, I can't make it, and I can't tell you why. And that the whole plot hinges around that one moment. Yeah. And it's got one of the best flashbacks I think I've ever seen in a film, because when they meet, him and also when they meet in the bar, in all the gin joints in all the world, etc., you know something absolutely extraordinary has taken place between them. And when you go back to the flashback, he appears to be a completely different character. He's light-hearted, he's upbeat, he's relaxed, and he's funny. And you realise that the relationship with her and the fact that she let him down and didn't come to meet him at the train has completely changed his character. Don't you think? That kind of broken personality, that cynical and untrusting person that he is. And then when they finally have that scene where they kind of make it all up again and the love affair appears to be rekindled, he goes back to his old self. It's fantastic, I think.
Yeah. Dooley Wilson singing As Time Goes By.
Who didn't play the piano, did he? He wasn't
didn't play the piano.
The drummer.
He was a drummer. He was a drummer.
Yeah.
And so he's miming to the piano which is being played, another piano. Those were the days.
Yeah.
It wasn't a recorded track.
Yeah.
So let's have one piano here and then let's have another piano out of shot over there is actually playing As Time Goes By or whatever. And Dooley is just miming along with it. But it's what I love about those kind of old 40s Hollywood films is we always think they're very sentimental. But actually underneath it all, they're very worldly wise and hard-boiled and cynical.
They are, very cynical.
You know, round up the usual suspects, which is the... you know, it's the great line. The final line in the film is, "This could be the start of a beautiful friendship,
beautiful relationship, isn't it?"
And
him and Renault, isn't it right?
They only came up with that line after the film had been finished.
Oh, right.
And so Bogart had come in and just voiced that.
Wow!
And so it's out of shot. You know, so that's added. It's amazing if you read about it how Casablanca was done, because they were writing it and rewriting it absolutely all the time. They had there's 16 writers or something like that, you know, credited as having
I'm not
worked.
surprised, because there are lines that you really remember. There's one where he's pointed the gun at Renault. He says, "This gun is pointed at your heart." He said, "That's my least vulnerable spot." It's just so that's your hard-boiled thing.
Absolutely.
And he says to her, "Maybe you'll regret this. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon and for the rest of your life."
But soon and for the rest.
It's
of your
fantastic.
Life.
The other thing is that, again, your hard-boiled theory is that you're not quite sure at the end whether they were both pretending to be in love with the other one. You know, is she pretending to be in love with him in order to get the visa so she can escape with her husband? And is he pretending to be in love with her so that he can engineer her escape because he wants her to escape with the husband? But you can't tell. You'd like to believe that they were still besotted, but it's all up in the air, isn't it? You can't really work it out.
That's why we're still watching it after all this time.
The Word Podcast. Fix yourself a drink and it's like being in the pub.
And we finish with our Patreon birthday boy, who's Paul Knox. Hello, Paul. How are you?
Hi, David. Hi, Mark. Yeah, I'm very well, thank you.
Very nice to see you. Happy birthday. And you've got a question for us.
I do indeed. It just occurred to me that, now when I look at television viewings, it used to be that, television programs used to get viewers of 20 million plus, and now they're happy to get 2 million. So the days of when everybody was watching TV is gone. And when you look back at the big musical events, so the big rock events on TV, are we now in a position to evaluate which were the really big events? So if you looked internationally, clearly the Beatles on Out of Sullivan, but I was thinking more of the UK, and what were the big events in the UK?
Well, the ones
from a TV perspective,
they were talking about musical things here. I can remember the Beatles on the Royal Variety performance. Yeah. So that's what, 63, is it? Yes, 63. Rattle your jewelry and so forth. Yeah. I can remember the All You Need Is Love broadcast, which is obviously black and white, which is reminds you how long ago it was. And I can also remember Magical Mystery Tour, where everybody gathered with their families, worst possible situation, with their families to watch this on Boxing Day.
Which was agony.
It was agony because it was terrible. And you knew it was terrible.
It really was awful. And the press absolutely hated them. And finally, they were waiting for the moment when the Beatles put a foot wrong and they'd found it. And that was heartbreaking, actually.
It's funny because whenever people talk about the Magical Mystery Tour now, and I do remember watching it, but people always say, oh, and the BBC's mistake was not putting it on in colour. Well, nobody had colour TV.
No, they didn't have colour TV.
So, there wasn't really an option there.
Yeah, no. But the interesting thing is that the ones you do remember were not necessarily mass audiences, but because you knew the audience who watched it. For instance, from the Whistle Test days, John Martin playing May You Never on the El Grey Whistle Test completely set the whole nation's view of what John Martin was forevermore, just on the basis of one appearance in front of the people who watched that kind of thing.
But I think the Old Grey Whistle Test, which always stood out to me, even though I missed it, but everybody talked about it, was Meatloaf, which made him enormous overnight.
Yeah, definitely.
That was huge. That was a ZZ Top, I think. I remember Beefheart particularly as being a big thing for my gang. And also the Talking Heads one. And Judy Sill was fantastic. But just sideways, another great moment, I think, was Beyonce at Glastonbury. Have you ever seen that? It's fantastic.
No, I've missed that.
Oh, astonishing.
Well, it's all there forevermore, of course, nowadays. And that's the other big difference. When you watched, the Beatles on the Royal Variety performance or any of these things, or even John Martin doing May You Never, you thought you were only going to see it once in your life. So you watched it with a completely different head on.
Yeah.
We cannot imagine nowadays what it's like to see something believing you're never going to see it again. You've got every fibre of your being is connected.
Complete concentration.
To that thing. But do you know what is the greatest? I'm glad you asked this question, Paul, because I can now tell the nation what is the greatest live performance ever recorded by television cameras. You can occasionally find it on YouTube before it gets taken down, probably by Dave Clark's lawyers, because I think he owns the copyright. The greatest is Otis Redding, Eric Burdon, and Chris Farlow doing Shake, the Sam Cooke song, on Red Steady Go in, I think, 1966. Honestly, if you can find that, it's absolutely mind-boggling. The dancers and absolutely everything. The level of energy is just astonishing. And of course, the amazing thing is it doesn't overwhelm the TV delivery of it, which very often those things do. Very often they can be too loud for television. Television is quite a small medium, whereas the whole thing about a rock and roll show is a big kind of overpowering thing. And sometimes it's too overpowering for the small screen. But that is perfect. If you haven't seen it,
I'll look out for that. I mean, funny enough, one thing, I was only 6 at the time, but I do remember from Ready, Steady, Go was Chris Farlow and Mick Jagger duetting on Out of Time.
There you go.
And there was just like a strange juxtaposition of Jagger being all energy and Chris Farlow being the opposite. I don't know, it always stuck in my mind. Sadly, that is no longer available.
Oh, well, keep looking. It may turn up again.
Yeah. But one that stood out for me, again, for a smaller audience, was the Sex Pistols on So It Goes, because I think that was their first TV appearance.
Yeah.
And it was just something like you'd never heard before. And they looked like nothing you'd ever seen before. And obviously, that is on YouTube. And you look at it now and it looks relatively innocent, but at the time, that was a huge thing.
Well, spend a happy day hunting around YouTube. There's tons of stuff. It may go away for a while. It will return. Paul, thanks very much for joining us and for your question.
No, my pleasure. Great.
Thanks,
and
happy birthday again.
Happy birthday! And if you'd like to be like Paul and have your birthday marked on the Word in Your Ear podcast, go to patreon.com/wordinyour ear for details. Cheers.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.